Captain Sarah Chen stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of Edwards Air Force Base. Her hands trembled as she gripped the cold porcelain sink. In 3 hours, she would climb into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor for the first time in over a decade. The same aircraft type that had ended her career at Top Gun and forced her into a life of secrets. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face. At 38, Sarah looked younger than her years. But the stress lines around her eyes told a different story. She had spent 11 years flying cargo planes and transport aircraft, deliberately avoiding anything that resembled her former life as one of the Navy's elite fighter pilots. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Emma. "Good luck today, Mom. You've got this." Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. Emma had no idea what her mother used to do before she was born. As far as the 15-year-old knew, Sarah had always been a transport pilot who moved supplies around the world. Sarah splashed cold water on her face and took a deep breath. She had to get through this day without anyone discovering her past. The Air Force had specifically requested her for this mission because of her clean record and steady hands with cargo operations. If they knew she had once been call-signed Phoenix at the Navy's elite fighter weapons school, everything would change. The irony was not lost on her. She had hidden her Top Gun credentials so well that the Air Force now saw her as the perfect candidate for a routine test flight. They needed someone with experience but without the ego or complications that came with fighter pilot backgrounds. Someone reliable and predictable. What they did not know was that Sarah Chen had graduated first in her Top Gun class 12 years ago. She had been considered one of the most naturally gifted pilots the Navy had ever seen. Her instructors said she had an almost supernatural ability to read the sky and anticipate her opponent's moves. She could execute maneuvers that other pilots could only dream about. But that was before the incident that changed everything. Sarah walked out of the bathroom and headed toward the briefing room. The corridors of Edwards were bustling with activity. Technicians wheeled equipment down the hallways, and pilots in flight suits discussed their missions in small groups. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged and what they were doing. She felt like an imposter. Colonel Martinez was already in the briefing room when Sarah arrived. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from 30 years in the military. Behind him stood Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the civilian contractor who had designed the new navigation system they would be testing. "Captain Chen, glad you could make it," Colonel Martinez said with a smile. "Dr. Walsh has been looking forward to meeting you. She specifically requested someone with your background for this test." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "My background? Sir?" 11 years of flawless cargo operations, Dr. Walsh interjected, extending her hand. "No fighter pilot theatrics. No need to prove anything. Just solid, dependable flying. That's exactly what we need for this test." Sarah shook the woman's hand and managed to smile. "If only they knew the truth," Dr. Walsh continued. "The new navigation system we're testing is designed for transport aircraft, but we want to see how it performs under stress conditions. The F-22 can create G-forces and flight patterns that will push the system to its limits. We need a pilot who won't get distracted by the thrill of flying a fighter jet." Colonel Martinez nodded. "Captain Chen has never flown anything more exciting than a C-130. She's perfect for keeping her focus on the mission instead of showing off." Sarah's jaw clenched. She had flown combat missions in F-18 Super Hornets. She had engaged enemy aircraft over the Persian Gulf. She had landed on aircraft carriers in rough seas and survived dogfights that would have terrified most pilots. But she could not tell them any of that. "I understand the mission parameters, sir," Sarah said quietly. "When do we begin the technical briefing?" For the next 2 hours, Dr. Walsh explained the navigation system in detail. It was designed to help transport pilots navigate in areas where GPS signals might be compromised. The system used a combination of star tracking, terrain mapping, and inertial guidance to maintain accurate positioning. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by the technology. It was far more advanced than anything she had used during her Top Gun days. But as Dr. Walsh talked, Sarah began to notice potential problems that the others had missed. "Dr. Walsh," Sarah said during a brief pause, What happens if the pilot needs to execute rapid altitude changes while the system is calculating star positions? Dr. Walsh looked surprised. That's a very specific question, Captain. Why would a transport pilot need to make rapid altitude changes? Sarah felt her cheeks flush. She had asked the question based on her fighter pilot experience, not her cargo background. I was just thinking about emergency situations, ma'am. Weather avoidance. That sort of thing. Well, the system should adjust automatically, Dr. Walsh replied. But Sarah could see uncertainty in her eyes. Colonel Martinez looked at Sarah with new interest. You seem to have a good understanding of flight dynamics, Captain. More than I would expect from someone who flies cargo runs. Sarah's heart raced. She had made a mistake. Her fighter pilot instincts had taken over, and she had asked questions that a cargo pilot would never think to ask. She needed to deflect attention quickly. I've always been interested in the technical aspects of flying, sir, she said. In my spare time, I read about advanced flight systems. It helps me understand my own aircraft better. See? The explanation seemed to satisfy Colonel Martinez. But Sarah noticed Dr. Walsh studying her more carefully. They moved to the hangar where the F-22 was waiting. Sarah had to use all her self-control to hide her reaction when she saw the aircraft. The Raptor was even more beautiful than she remembered. Its angular lines and predatory stance made it look like a piece of alien technology. She had flown in F-22 seconds twice during her Top Gun training, both times as part of advanced inter-service exercises. The aircraft was unlike anything else in the sky. Its stealth capabilities, advanced radar, and incredible maneuverability made it the ultimate fighter jet. But Sarah had to pretend she had never seen one before. Impressive, isn't it? Colonel Martinez said, noticing her expression. I know you cargo pilots don't get to see equipment like this very often. It's certainly different from what I'm used to, sir, Sarah replied, which was technically true. She was used to the older F-18 seconds from her Navy days. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, began walking them around the aircraft. He explained the basic systems and emergency procedures. Sarah listened politely, even though she probably knew more about F-22 systems than he did. The ejection seat is pretty straightforward, Sergeant Rodriguez explained. Just like any other military aircraft, but with a few upgrades. Have you ever had to eject, Captain? Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second. She had ejected once, during a training accident at Top Gun, but she could not mention that. No, Sergeant. I've been fortunate to avoid that experience. Good, he replied. Let's hope today doesn't change that. They continued the walk-around inspection. Sarah found herself automatically checking things that a cargo pilot would never think to examine. She looked at the aircraft's weapons pylons, even though they were empty for this test flight. She studied the air intakes for signs of damage or foreign object debris. She examined the landing gear with the eye of someone who had made countless carrier landings. Dr. Walsh was watching her again. You're very thorough, Captain, the scientist observed. Most pilots just listen to the crew chief and trust that everything is ready. Sarah realized she had made another mistake. She was inspecting the aircraft like a fighter pilot, not like someone who flew cargo planes. I believe in being careful, ma'am. My cargo work has taught me that small problems can become big ones very quickly. It was a weak explanation, but it seemed to work. They climbed up to the cockpit, and Sarah felt her breath catch. The F-22's instrument panel was a work of art. Multiple computer displays showed flight information, weapon status, and radar data. The controls were laid out with military precision, every switch and button placed exactly where a pilot would need it during combat. Sarah's hands moved unconsciously toward the controls before she caught herself. She had to pretend this was all new and overwhelming. It's quite a bit more complex than a C-130, I imagine, Colonel Martinez said with a chuckle. Yes, sir. It's going to take some getting used to, Sarah replied, forcing herself to look confused and intimidated. Dr. Walsh was taking notes on a tablet. Captain, I want you to know that this is a very routine test flight. We're not asking you to push the aircraft to its limits or perform any aggressive maneuvers. We just need smooth, steady flying while the navigation system does its work. Sarah nodded. I understand, ma'am. Smooth and steady is what I do best. But even as she said it, Sarah knew that flying smooth and steady in an F-22 was like trying to drive a Formula One car in a parking lot. The aircraft was built for speed, agility, and combat. It wanted to fly fast and hard. Keeping it tame would require all of her self-control. They spent another hour going over procedures and emergency protocols. Sarah had to pretend to learn systems she already knew by heart. She asked basic questions that she hoped a cargo pilot would ask, while carefully avoiding anything that would reveal her fighter background. Finally, Colonel Martinez looked at his watch. I think we're ready to suit up, Captain. Are you feeling confident about this? Sarah met his eyes and nodded. Ready as I'll ever be, sir. As they walked toward the equipment room to get her flight suit and helmet, Sarah's mind raced. She had successfully hidden her Top Gun background for over a decade. She had built a new career based on the fiction that she was just another cargo pilot who happened to be good at her job. But now she was about to climb into an F-22 Raptor, the most advanced fighter jet in the world. The aircraft that represented everything she used to be and everything she had tried to forget. The equipment room was filled with flight suits, helmets, and survival gear. Master Sergeant Rodriguez helped her select the right sizes and showed her how to adjust the various straps and connections. The G-suit is pretty standard, he explained as Sarah stepped into the pressurized garment. It'll help keep the blood in your head during maneuvers. Though, I don't expect you'll be pulling many Gs on this flight. Sarah almost laughed. She had pulled 8 Gs during carrier operations and 9 Gs during a particularly intense Top Gun exercise. But she just nodded and let him explain how the suit worked. The helmet was next. As Sarah put it on, she felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. The weight, the fit, the way it connected to the aircraft systems. It all brought back memories of her fighter pilot days. For a moment, she was Phoenix again, the pilot who had never met a challenge she could not handle. Then Dr. Walsh's voice brought her back to reality. The navigation system will be feeding data to your helmet display. You'll see small icons and readouts that show the system's calculations. Just ignore them and fly normally. We'll analyze the data later. Sarah adjusted the helmet's position and checked the connections. Everything felt familiar, like putting on an old pair of comfortable shoes. But she had to act like it was all new and slightly overwhelming. This is a lot more complicated than what I'm used to, she said, which was true in a way. The F-22's systems were far more advanced than the F-18 she had flown at Top Gun. They walked back out to the aircraft. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the flight line. Other aircraft were lined up in neat rows. F-35, F-16, and various test aircraft. It was like a museum of military aviation. Sarah climbed up the ladder to the F-22's cockpit. The crew chief helped her settle into the ejection seat and began connecting the various life support systems. Oxygen, communications, emergency power. Each connection brought her closer to the moment when she would have to fly this aircraft without revealing who she really was. Comfortable? Sergeant Rodriguez asked as he tightened the last strap. Getting there, Sarah replied. In truth, the cockpit felt like home. The F-22 was designed around the pilot, with every control positioned for maximum efficiency during combat. It was a fighter pilot's dream machine. Dr. Walsh appeared at the side of the cockpit with her tablet. Captain, remember that this is all about the navigation system. Don't worry about the aircraft's performance capabilities. Just fly a standard test pattern and let our equipment do the work. Sarah nodded and began running through the pre-flight checklist. Her hands moved automatically to the right, switches and controls. Electrical power, hydraulic pressure, flight control checks. She had done this sequence hundreds of times before, though never in an F-22. The engines came online with a deep rumble that she felt in her chest. The F-22's Pratt & Whitney engines were marvels of engineering, capable of pushing the aircraft beyond the speed of sound without afterburners. Sarah had to resist the urge to push the throttles forward and feel that incredible power. Edwards Tower, this is Raptor 01, ready for taxi, she called over the radio. Raptor 01, Edwards Tower, taxi to runway 27 left. Winds 270 at 8 knots. Sarah released the brakes and began taxiing toward the runway. The F-22 moved like a caged predator, powerful and eager to hunt. She could feel the aircraft's potential in every control input, every slight movement of the stick. As they approached the runway, Sarah's radio crackled with Dr. Walsh's voice. "Navigation system is online and collecting data. Everything looks good from here." "Copy that," Sarah replied. "Raptor 01, ready for takeoff." She lined up on the runway's center line and pushed the throttles forward. The F-22 accelerated smoothly, its engines producing a sound like controlled thunder. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being pressed back into her seat as the aircraft gathered speed. At 150 knots, she pulled back on the stick, and the F-22 leaped into the sky like it had been shot from a cannon. The climb rate was incredible, far beyond anything a cargo plane could achieve. Sarah had to consciously throttle back to avoid climbing too aggressively and revealing her comfort with high-performance flight. "Wow," she said over the radio, trying to sound amazed rather than nostalgic. "This thing really climbs." Colonel Martinez's voice came through her headset. "Welcome to the world of fighter jets, Captain. Try not to get too addicted." If only he knew, Sarah thought as she leveled off at 10,000 feet and began the prescribed test pattern. The F-22 flew like a dream, responding to her slightest input with precision and power. It wanted to roll, loop, and dive. It wanted to dance through the sky at speeds that would terrify most pilots, but Sarah had to keep it boring. She had to fly like someone who had never experienced the pure joy of high-performance flight. She had to pretend that this magnificent machine was just another aircraft to her. As she flew the rectangular pattern that Dr. Walsh had requested, Sarah's mind wandered back to the incident that had ended her Top Gun career. It had been a perfect California morning. Much like today, she had been flying an F-18 Super Hornet in a simulated dogfight exercise against another Top Gun student. The memory was still painful, even after 12 years. The F-22's navigation display flickered with data as Sarah completed the first leg of her test pattern. Dr. Walsh's experimental system was working perfectly, tracking the aircraft's position using star charts and terrain mapping. But Sarah's attention was divided between flying the mission and fighting the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. 12 years ago, she had been Lieutenant Sarah Chen, callsign Phoenix, one of only 3 female pilots in her Top Gun class. She had earned her spot through exceptional performance in the fleet, shooting down 2 enemy aircraft during combat operations in the Persian Gulf. The Navy had high hopes for her future as a fighter pilot. The incident happened during the final week of the course. Sarah and her classmate, Lieutenant Rick Maverick Thompson, were engaged in a 1-versus-1 air combat exercise. It was meant to be routine training, the kind of dogfight simulation that Top Gun students performed dozens of times. But something went wrong. Sarah remembered the moment perfectly. They were both in F-18 Super Hornets, circling each other at 15,000 feet. Rick had just executed a split-S maneuver, diving away from her attack and reversing direction. It was a textbook defensive move, exactly what they had been taught. Sarah followed him down, trying to maintain her firing position. The 2 aircraft were pulling heavy Gs, dancing through the sky in a deadly ballet. She had Rick locked up on her targeting radar when his aircraft suddenly stopped responding to his control inputs. Later investigation revealed a hydraulic failure in Rick's F-18. His flight controls had seized up just as he was pulling out of the dive. The aircraft continued descending toward the desert floor, completely out of control. Standard procedure called for immediate ejection. Any pilot with basic training would have pulled the ejection handles and trusted the parachute to save his life. But Rick Thompson was not just any pilot. He was the kind of aviator who believed he could fly anything, fix anything, overcome any emergency through skill and determination. Sarah watched in horror as Rick fought to regain control of his aircraft. He was only 3,000 feet above the ground and losing altitude rapidly. She called out on the radio, urging him to eject, but he ignored her warnings. Then Sarah made the decision that ended her career. Instead of following protocol and maintaining safe distance from the emergency, she dove after Rick's aircraft. She positioned her F-18 directly above his, trying to use her aircraft's wake turbulence to disrupt the airflow around his jet. It was an insane maneuver, something no pilot had ever attempted before. Her plan was to create enough aerodynamic disturbance to jar Rick's controls loose. If she could generate the right kind of air turbulence at exactly the right moment, it might restore hydraulic pressure to his flight systems. It worked. The wash from Sarah's engines hit Rick's aircraft just as he was pulling back on the stick. The sudden change in airflow restored partial control to his F-18, allowing him to level off barely 1,000 feet above the desert. He was able to make an emergency landing at a nearby airfield, walking away from what should have been a fatal crash. Sarah had saved his life through a combination of split-second decision-making and impossible flying. It was the kind of rescue that should have made her a legend in naval aviation. Instead, it destroyed her career. The investigation board was not impressed by Sarah's heroics. They were furious. She had violated multiple safety regulations, put 2 aircraft at risk instead of 1, and performed an unauthorized maneuver that could have killed both pilots. The fact that it worked was irrelevant. She had endangered lives through reckless flying. Worse, the incident raised questions about Sarah's judgment and emotional stability. The investigators suggested that she had acted impulsively, driven by feelings rather than training. They questioned whether she could be trusted in future combat situations. The final report was devastating. Sarah was removed from the Top Gun program just 2 weeks before graduation. Her commanding officer recommended that she be transferred to non-combat duties, citing concerns about her decision-making under pressure. The Navy offered her a choice: accept transfer to cargo operations or face a court-martial for violating flight safety regulations. Sarah chose the transfer. She spent 6 months flying C-2 cargo planes before requesting discharge from the Navy. The official reason was family obligations. She was pregnant with Emma and wanted to focus on motherhood. But the real reason was that she could not bear to continue flying military aircraft while carrying the stigma of her Top Gun failure. Sarah joined the Air Force as a civilian contractor 2 years later, carefully hiding her Top Gun background. She created a fictional military record that showed steady but unremarkable service as a transport pilot. Her references were people who understood the need for discretion, fellow pilots who had faced their own career setbacks. For 11 years, the deception had worked perfectly. Sarah Chen, cargo pilot, was reliable, competent, and invisible. She flew supplies to remote bases, transported equipment around the world, and never drew attention to herself. She was exactly the kind of pilot that military bureaucracies loved: predictable, steady, and uncomplicated. But now, flying this F-22 Raptor through the Nevada sky, Sarah felt all the old instincts awakening. The aircraft responded to her touch like a living thing, eager to show off its incredible capabilities. Every turn, every climb, every subtle control input reminded her of what she used to be. Navigation system is performing beautifully, Doctor. Walsh's voice crackled through the radio. Can you give us a few more turns at different altitudes? I want to see how the star tracking works during altitude changes. Roger that, Sarah replied, beginning a gentle climb to 20,000 feet. The F-22 ascended effortlessly, its engines barely working to push the sleek aircraft higher. As she climbed, Sarah noticed something on her radar display. 3 aircraft were approaching from the west, flying in formation. According to her identification system, they were F-16 Fighting Falcons from the nearby test squadron. Probably just another routine training flight, but something about their flight pattern caught her attention. The 3 F-16 seconds were approaching at different altitudes and speeds, setting up what looked like a practice intercept. They might not even know that Sarah's F-22 was in the area. Edwards Tower, Raptor 01, Sarah called. I'm showing 3 F-16 seconds approaching from the west. Are they aware of my position? There was a pause before the tower responded. Raptor 01. Those aircraft are on a different frequency conducting their own training exercise. Maintain current altitude and heading. Separation is adequate. Sarah frowned. The radar picture suggested otherwise. The lead F-16 was climbing directly toward her altitude, while the other 2 were positioning themselves for a classic pincer movement. Either they were incredibly sloppy with their navigation, or they were using her F-22 as an unexpected target of opportunity. Dr. Walsh, are we expecting any interaction with other aircraft during this test? Sarah asked. Negative, Captain, the scientist replied. This should be a clear practice area. Why do you ask? Before Sarah could answer, her radar warning receiver began chirping. The distinctive sound meant that another aircraft was painting her with targeting radar. One of the F-16s had locked onto the F-22. Edwards Tower. Raptor 01 is being targeted by unknown aircraft, Sarah reported, trying to keep the alarm out of her voice. Request immediate clarification. The response came not from the tower, but from the lead F-16 pilot. His voice was young and confident, with the cocky edge that Sarah remembered from her own fighter pilot days. Raptor 01, this is Viper Lead. You've wandered into our training area. We're conducting combat air patrol exercises. Recommend you change course immediately. Sarah checked her charts. According to her flight plan, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The F-16s were the ones who had entered her assigned practice area. Viper Lead, Raptor 01. I'm flying an assigned test route. My understanding is that this airspace is reserved for navigation system testing. Negative, Raptor driver, came the reply. This is our scheduled cap area. You need to move along before someone gets embarrassed. Sarah felt her jaw clench. The F-16 pilot was challenging her, assuming that she would back down rather than face confrontation. He probably figured that a transport pilot flying a borrowed F-22 would immediately turn tail and run. Under normal circumstances, he would be right. Sarah Chen, cargo pilot, would apologize politely and change course to avoid any trouble. She would report the incident through proper channels and let others sort out the conflicting flight schedules. But sitting in the cockpit of the world's most advanced fighter jet, Sarah felt her old instincts taking over. The F-16 pilot's dismissive tone triggered memories of every time she had been underestimated. Every time someone had assumed she could not handle a challenging situation. Dr. Walsh, Sarah called on her primary radio frequency. We have a situation developing here. 3 F-16s are attempting to force us out of our assigned test area. Quote, that's impossible. Dr. Walsh replied. We have exclusive use of this airspace for the next 2 hours. Can you maintain course and continue the test? Sarah looked at her radar display. The 3 F-16s had spread out into an attack formation, with the lead aircraft directly ahead and the wingmen positioning themselves on either side. It was a textbook intercept setup, designed to give the F-22 nowhere to run. On her radio, Viper Lead was becoming more aggressive. Raptor 01, this is your final warning. Change course immediately, or we'll be forced to take action. Sarah almost laughed. Take action with what? The F-16s were carrying practice missiles with dummy warheads. Even if they fired, the worst they could do was mark her aircraft with tracking dye. But the principle of the thing irritated her. More than that, the tactical situation was awakening instincts that Sarah had tried to suppress for over a decade. She could see exactly how the 3 F-16s planned to attack. She could anticipate their moves, exploit their weaknesses, and defeat their formation with contemptuous ease. The F-22 Raptor was designed specifically to dominate aircraft like the F-16. Its stealth characteristics, advanced radar, and superior maneuverability made it nearly invincible in air-to-air combat. Even an average pilot could use the F-22's advantages to outfight multiple enemy aircraft. And Sarah was not an average pilot. She was Phoenix, the Top Gun graduate who had never lost a dogfight during her Navy career. Viper Lead, Sarah called, making her decision. Raptor 01 will maintain current course and altitude. If you have a problem with that, take it up with Edwards Tower. Roger that, Raptor, came the reply. You asked for it. The lead F-16 suddenly accelerated, climbing toward Sarah's altitude in what appeared to be a head-on attack run. His wingmen moved to flanking positions, ready to engage if Sarah tried to evade in either direction. It was exactly the kind of 3 versus 1 scenario that Top Gun students trained for extensively. Sarah had faced similar situations dozens of times during her Navy career, but she was supposed to be a cargo pilot now, someone who would panic under pressure and make mistakes. Instead, Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her. Time seemed to slow down, as her mind automatically began calculating intercept angles, closure rates, and firing solutions. The F-22's flight controls felt like extensions of her own body. "Dr. Walsh," Sarah called calmly, "I'm going to need to deviate from the test profile for a few minutes. We have aggressive aircraft inbound. Captain Chen, you're not trained for air-to-air combat." Dr. Walsh's voice was tight with worry. "Perhaps we should abort the test and return to base." "Negative," Sarah replied. "I can handle this." The words were out before she could stop them. A cargo pilot would never claim to be able to handle a fighter jet confrontation. Sarah had just revealed that she knew more about air combat than her file suggested. But there was no time to worry about that now. Viper lead was only 5 miles away, and closing fast. His targeting radar was locked onto the F-22, and Sarah could see practice missiles hanging under his wings. She pushed the F-22's throttles forward and felt the aircraft surge ahead with incredible power. The Raptor accelerated so smoothly that Sarah barely felt the G-forces. Within seconds, she was supersonic and still accelerating. The sudden burst of speed caught the F-16 pilots off guard. They had expected the F-22 to turn and run, not accelerate directly toward them. Viper lead's intercept geometry was suddenly all wrong, his aircraft unable to match the Raptor's incredible performance. Sarah flashed past the F-16 formation at Mach 1.5, too fast for them to react. By the time they realized what had happened, she was already 5 miles behind them and turning for another pass. "What the hell?" Viper lead's voice crackled over the radio. "How did a cargo pilot learn to fly like that?" Sarah smiled grimly as she brought the F-22 around in a crushing 8G turn. The aircraft responded instantly, its thrust vectoring system allowing maneuvers that would be impossible in any other fighter jet. She was now positioned perfectly for a stern attack on the 3 F-16 seconds. "Viper flight," Sarah called, her voice steady despite the tremendous G-forces. "This is your first and final warning. Clear this airspace immediately." The 3 F-16 pilots tried to split up, each one turning in a different direction to avoid her attack. It was a standard defensive maneuver, designed to force the attacker to choose one target and allow the others to escape. But the F-22 was not a standard aircraft. Its advanced radar could track multiple targets simultaneously, and its maneuverability allowed Sarah to engage all 3 F-16 seconds in rapid succession. She rolled inverted and dove toward Viper 3, the wingman on the right. Her radar locked onto his aircraft instantly, and she heard the steady tone that indicated a perfect firing solution. If this had been real combat with live weapons, Viper 3 would already be dead. "Viper 3, you're shot," Sarah announced calmly. "RTB immediately." The F-16 pilot acknowledged with obvious frustration and turned toward home base. 1 down, 2 to go. Sarah rolled wings level and pulled into a vertical climb, using the F-22's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to position herself above the remaining 2 F-16 seconds. From her perch at 30,000 feet, she could see both aircraft clearly on her radar display. Viper 2 was attempting to climb after her, but his F-16 could not match the Raptor's performance at high altitude. Viper lead had given up on climbing and was instead trying to escape at low level, hoping to use terrain masking to break radar contact. Neither tactic would work against an F-22. Sarah rolled into a split S maneuver, diving toward Viper 2 with devastating speed. The F-16 pilots saw her coming and tried to turn away, but the F-22's superior energy allowed Sarah to follow his every move. Within 30 seconds, she had maneuvered behind him and achieved another radar lock. "Viper 2, you're shot," she announced. "RTB now." That left only Viper lead, who was now flying low and fast toward the mountains, probably hoping to force Sarah into a turning fight at low altitude, where the F-16's lighter weight might give him an advantage. It was a reasonable strategy against most opponents. But Sarah had fought similar battles during her Top Gun training, and she knew exactly how to counter this tactic. Instead of following Viper lead down to low altitude, Sarah remained high and fast, using the F-22's advanced radar to track the F-16 through the terrain. When Viper Lead emerged from behind a mountain ridge, Sarah was already positioned for a perfect intercept. She dove toward the F-16 like a hawk stooping on prey. Viper Lead saw her coming and tried to turn into her attack, hoping to force a head-on engagement where his lighter aircraft might have a maneuverability advantage. But the F-22's thrust vectoring system allowed Sarah to turn inside the F-16's radius with ease. She slipped behind Viper Lead's aircraft and achieved yet another radar lock. Viper Lead, "You're shot," Sarah announced. "Exercise complete." RTB immediately. There was a long pause before Viper Lead responded. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with amazement and respect. "Raptor 01, that was some impressive flying. Where did you learn to handle a fighter like that?" Sarah felt her heart sink. She had been so focused on the engagement that she had forgotten to hide her abilities. In the space of 10 minutes, she had demonstrated fighter pilot skills that no cargo pilot should possess. There was no way to explain away what had just happened. "Just got lucky, I guess," Sarah replied weakly. "Negative, Raptor," Viper Lead shot back. "Luck doesn't fly like that. You just outfought 3 experienced fighter pilots in aircraft you're supposedly unfamiliar with. That takes training and skill." Dr. Walsh's voice came over the radio, tight with confusion and suspicion. "Captain Chen, we need to discuss what just happened here." That was not the flying profile of a transport pilot. Sarah's radio crackled with Colonel Martinez's voice. "Raptor 01. Return to base immediately. We have some questions that need answers." As Sarah turned the F-22 toward Edwards Air Force Base, she realized that her carefully constructed cover story was beginning to unravel. 11 years of hiding her Top Gun background had just been undone by 10 minutes of instinctive flying. But as much as she dreaded the coming interrogation, Sarah had to admit that it felt good to be Phoenix again. If only for a few minutes. The F-22 had awakened something in her that she had tried to bury for over a decade. The pure joy of being one of the best fighter pilots in the world. The F-22 touched down on Edwards' runway with barely a whisper, its advanced landing systems making the arrival seem effortless. But Sarah's hands were shaking as she taxied back to the hangar. In the space of one test flight, she had destroyed 11 years of careful deception. As she shut down the engines and went through the post-flight checklist, Sarah could see Colonel Martinez and Dr. Walsh waiting by the aircraft. Both looked serious, and she could tell from their body language that her cover story was about to face serious scrutiny. The crew chief helped her out of the cockpit, and Sarah tried to maintain the facade of being just another cargo pilot who had gotten lucky. But she could feel their eyes on her, studying every movement, every reaction. "Captain Chen," Colonel Martinez said as soon as her feet touched the ground. "That was quite a performance up there. Dr. Walsh and I would like to debrief you immediately." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, removing her helmet. "I hope the navigation system test went well." Dr. Walsh stepped forward, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. "The navigation system performed flawlessly, Captain, but that's not what concerns us right now. What concerns us is how a cargo pilot with no fighter training just outflew 3 experienced F-16 pilots." Sarah had prepared for this moment for years, rehearsing explanations that might cover any slip-ups in her carefully constructed background. But she had never imagined a scenario quite like this. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am," Sarah said, trying to sound confused. "Those F-16 seconds entered our test area and seemed aggressive. I just tried to avoid them and get out of their way." Colonel Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Captain, you executed maneuvers that would challenge an experienced fighter pilot. You demonstrated tactical knowledge and flying skills that don't appear anywhere in your personnel file. How do you explain that?" "Oh," before Sarah could answer, another voice joined the conversation. "Maybe I can help explain it." Sarah turned to see a man in his 50s approaching from the hangar. He was wearing a civilian contractor badge, but something about his bearing suggested military background. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and the kind of confident stride that came from years of command authority. "And you are?" Colonel Martinez asked. "John Morrison, retired Navy captain," the man replied, extending his hand. "I was the commanding officer of VFA 103 when Lieutenant Chen served in the fleet. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Captain Morrison had been her squadron commander during her combat deployments. Before she was selected for Top Gun, he was one of the few people who knew her complete military history. I was visiting Edwards to consult on another project when I heard the radio chatter from today's exercise. Morrison continued. I recognized the tactical flying immediately. That was Phoenix up there. Dr. Walsh looked confused. Phoenix? Morrison smiled. Lieutenant Sarah Chen's call sign during her time as a naval aviator. She was one of the most naturally gifted fighter pilots I ever saw. Shot down 2 enemy aircraft during combat operations in the Persian Gulf. Colonel Martinez stared at Sarah with growing understanding. Captain Chen, you were a fighter pilot? Sarah realized that lying was no longer an option. Morrison knew her history, and he could easily verify everything through official Navy records. Her carefully maintained cover story was finished. Yes, sir, she admitted quietly. I was a naval aviator for 6 years. F-18 Hornets and Super Hornets. And Top Gun? Dr. Walsh asked, having overheard Morrison's earlier comment. Sarah hesitated. This was the part of her history that she most wanted to keep hidden. But Morrison was looking at her expectantly, and she knew he would fill in the details if she remained silent. Yes, ma'am. I attended the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Attended? Morrison laughed. Captain Chen graduated first in her class. She was considered one of the most promising fighter pilots of her generation. Colonel Martinez was studying Sarah with new interest. If you were such a promising fighter pilot, Captain, why are you flying cargo planes? And why isn't any of this in your personnel file? This was the question Sarah had been dreading for 11 years. How do you explain that you threw away a brilliant career because of one moment of heroism that was judged as reckless endangerment? It's complicated, sir, Sarah said carefully. Morrison stepped in again. There was an incident during her final week at Top Gun. Lieutenant Chen made a split-second decision that saved another pilot's life. The investigation board didn't see it the same way she did. What kind of incident? Dr. Walsh asked. Sarah took a deep breath. She had never told this story to anyone outside the official investigation. Even Emma didn't know the full details of why her mother had left the Navy. Another student lost control of his aircraft during a training exercise, Sarah began. He was going down and refused to eject. I tried to help him regain control by using wake turbulence from my aircraft. Colonel Martinez whistled softly. That's an extremely dangerous maneuver. Did it work? Yes, sir. The other pilot was able to land safely. But the investigation board ruled that I had violated multiple safety protocols and endangered both aircraft unnecessarily. Morrison nodded. The board recommended that she be removed from fighter operations due to questions about her judgment under pressure. Rather than accept a transfer to a non-combat role, Lieutenant Chen chose to leave the Navy. Dr. Walsh was taking notes rapidly on her tablet. So you've been hiding your fighter pilot background for over a decade? Yes, ma'am. I rebuilt my career as a transport pilot. I wanted to fly without the complications that came with my Navy record. Colonel Martinez was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he spoke. Captain Chen, do you understand that you've been flying under false pretenses? Your personnel file shows no indication of fighter pilot training or combat experience. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. After 11 years of successful deception, everything was falling apart in a single afternoon. Her career was probably over, and she had no idea how to explain this to Emma. I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility for any discrepancies in my records. Discrepancies? Colonel Martinez almost smiled. Captain, you just demonstrated that you're probably one of the most capable fighter pilots on this base. That's not a discrepancy. That's a hidden asset. Sarah looked up in surprise. She had expected immediate disciplinary action, possibly even criminal charges for falsifying military records. But Colonel Martinez seemed more intrigued than angry. Dr. Walsh was studying her tablet intently. Captain Chen, I have to ask, Why didn't you volunteer your fighter pilot background when we were looking for someone to test the navigation system? Your combat experience would have been exactly what we needed. Because I didn't want anyone to know, Sarah admitted. I built a new career based on being reliable and predictable. Fighter pilots are seen as risk-takers and glory hounds. I wanted to be known for steady competence, not dramatic heroics. Morrison laughed. Phoenix, you could never be predictable. Even in the fleet, you were always finding new ways to push the envelope. Remember that time you landed on the carrier during a storm that had grounded everyone else? That was different, Sarah protested. We had wounded Marines who needed immediate medical attention. Someone had to get them back to the ship. And you volunteered for a carrier landing in weather that would have challenged a test pilot, Morrison continued. You've never been able to resist a challenge when lives were on the line. Colonel Martinez was looking thoughtful. Captain, I need to ask you directly. Is there anything else in your background that we should know about? Any other hidden qualifications or experience that might be relevant? Relevant. Sarah considered the question carefully. There were other aspects of her Navy career that she had concealed. Training programs and special operations that were still classified, but nothing that would affect her current situation. No, sir. Fighter pilot training and combat experience are the main items missing from my file. Dr. Walsh looked up from her tablet. Captain, I have a confession to make. When I requested a cargo pilot for this test, it wasn't because I wanted someone without fighter experience. It was because I wanted someone who wouldn't try to show off and interfere with the navigation system data. I understand, ma'am, but after watching your performance today, I'm wondering if we've been approaching this test all wrong. The navigation system is designed to help transport pilots navigate in hostile environments. Shouldn't we be testing it under realistic combat conditions? Colonel Martinez nodded slowly. Dr. Walsh has a point. If this system is going to be used in real-world operations, it needs to work when pilots are under stress, pulling heavy Gs, and dealing with threats. Sarah felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. They were talking about the kind of challenging test mission that would require all of her skills as a fighter pilot. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked. Dr. Walsh smiled. I'm suggesting that we scrap the gentle test profile and design something that will really push the system to its limits. High-speed maneuvering, defensive tactics, multiple altitude changes, everything a transport pilot might encounter in a combat zone. Morrison clapped Sarah on the shoulder. Sounds like they want Phoenix back in action. For the first time in 11 years, Sarah felt the old excitement building inside her. The prospect of flying a challenging mission, of using her skills to their fullest extent, was intoxicating, but she also felt terrified. What if she had lost her edge during all those years of flying cargo planes? I'd be willing to participate in a more challenging test profile, Sarah said carefully. But I should point out that I haven't flown air-to-air combat in over a decade. My skills might be rusty. Colonel Martinez laughed. Captain, you just defeated 3 F-16s in an aircraft you'd supposedly never flown before. If that's rusty, I'd hate to see you at full capability. Dr. Walsh was already making notes on her tablet. We'll need to redesign the test profile completely. Instead of peaceful navigation exercises, we'll create scenarios that simulate real combat environments. Electronic jamming, multiple threats, time-critical navigation requirements. And we'll need to inform the rest of the test team about Captain Chen's actual background. Colonel Martinez added. No more pretending to be just another cargo pilot. Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with anxiety. After 11 years of hiding, she would finally be able to use her real name and qualifications. But she would also be exposed to scrutiny from people who might question her past decisions. Sir, what about the discrepancies in my personnel file? Will there be an investigation? Colonel Martinez considered the question. Captain, as far as I'm concerned, we've discovered that you have additional qualifications that make you more valuable to this project. I'm not interested in punishing someone for being overqualified. Morrison nodded. Besides, the statute of limitations on any administrative violations has long since expired. You've been performing your duties competently for 11 years. That speaks well of your character and professionalism. Dr. Walsh was still focused on the technical aspects. Captain Chen, or should I say, Phoenix, how soon can you be ready for an advanced test profile? Sarah thought about it. She would need time to familiarize herself with the F-22's more advanced systems, review air-to-air combat procedures, and shake off the rust from years of transport flying. But the basic skills were still there, as she had proven during the encounter with the F-16. Give me a few days to review the aircraft systems and refresh my tactical knowledge, Sarah said. I can be ready by the end of the week. Excellent, Dr. Walsh replied. I'll start working on a new test matrix immediately. We're going to push this navigation system harder than any equipment has ever been tested before. As they walked back toward the hangar, Sarah felt like she was stepping out of a shadow that had covered her for 11 years. For the first time since leaving Top Gun, she would be able to fly under her true identity, using all of her skills and experience. But there was one more conversation she had to have, one that might be more difficult than explaining herself to military investigators. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. Emma was upstairs doing homework, and the house was quiet, except for the tick of the wall clock. Sarah had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times over the years, but she had never imagined it would happen like this. Finally, she picked up the phone and dialed her daughter's number. Emma, can you come downstairs for a minute? There's something I need to tell you about my work. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, looking concerned. At 15, she was already taller than her mother, with the same dark hair and determined expression that Sarah saw in her own mirror every morning. What's wrong? Mom? You look worried. Sarah gestured to the chair across from her. Sit down, honey. This is going to take a while. Emma sat down, her expression becoming more serious. Are you in trouble at work? Not exactly. But I haven't been completely honest with you about what I used to do before you were born. Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell her daughter the truth about Lieutenant Sarah Chen, call sign Phoenix, and the reason why she had spent 11 years flying cargo planes instead of fighter jets. Emma listened without interrupting, her eyes growing wider as the story unfolded. When Sarah finished, there was a long silence. So you were basically like Top Gun? Emma finally asked. Sarah smiled. I was actually at Top Gun, the real Navy fighter weapons school. And you've been hiding this my whole life? Yes. I thought it was better if people saw me as just another transport pilot. Fighter pilots have a reputation for being reckless and unpredictable. Emma considered this. Mom, you realize this is the coolest thing ever, right? My mother was a fighter pilot who saved someone's life by doing something impossible. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. She had expected Emma to be angry about the deception, or at least disappointed that her mother had given up such an exciting career. You're not upset that I lied to you? Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand. Mom, you didn't lie. You just didn't tell me everything, and now I understand why you always seem to know so much about flying, even though you claim to just carry cargo around. What do you mean? Remember when I was 10 and asked you how planes stay in the air? You didn't give me some simple explanation about lift and thrust. You drew diagrams of airfoils and explained how angle of attack affects stall characteristics. I thought all pilots knew that stuff. Sarah laughed. I guess I got a little carried away. And you're always watching military aircraft when they fly over. You identify them by sound before you even see them. That's not something a cargo pilot would necessarily know. Sarah realized that her daughter had been more observant than she had given her credit for. Were there other clues? Emma smiled. Mom, you taught me to parallel park by explaining it in terms of aerial combat tactics. You said parking was like positioning for a gun attack. You had to predict where the target would be, not where it was. That's actually a good analogy. It's also not how normal parents teach driving. Emma laughed. So what happens now? Are you going back to being a fighter pilot? Sarah considered the question. The test mission with Dr. Walsh was just the beginning. If she performed well, there might be other opportunities to use her real skills. But she was 38 years old, and the military was typically a young person's game. I don't know, honey. We'll have to see how this test mission goes, but at least I won't have to pretend anymore. Emma squeezed her mother's hand. I'm proud of you, Mom, for what you did at Top Gun, and for what you've done since then. You've been the best mother I could ask for, whether you were flying fighter jets or cargo planes. As they sat there holding hands across the kitchen table, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For 11 years, she had carried the burden of her hidden past, afraid that people would judge her for the decisions she had made. But Emma's acceptance reminded her that the most important opinions in her life came from people who loved her regardless of her career choices. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for the most challenging test mission of her career. She would step back into the world of high-performance flight and tactical aviation that she had left behind so many years ago. But tonight, she was just Sarah Chen, a mother who had finally found the courage to tell her daughter the truth about who she really was. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the Edwards briefing room facing a very different audience than before. Gone was the small group of scientists and technicians who had planned the original navigation test. In their place sat 12 of the most experienced test pilots and combat aviators in the United States Air Force. Colonel Martinez had assembled what he called a red team to challenge Dr. Walsh's navigation system under realistic combat conditions. The pilots around the table included veterans of air campaigns in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other classified operations. These were the kind of aviators who would actually use the navigation system in real-world missions. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Martinez began. I'd like you to meet Captain Sarah Chen, callsign Phoenix. Some of you may have heard about her performance against our F-16 squadron earlier this week. Major Lisa Torres, the squadron's senior test pilot, looked up from her briefing notes. You're the cargo pilot who outfought 3 Vipers in an aircraft you'd never flown before? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. For the first time in 11 years, she would introduce herself using her real qualifications. Actually, Major, I'm not a cargo pilot. I'm a former Navy fighter pilot, F-18 Hornets and Super Hornets, with combat experience in the Persian Gulf. I graduated from Top Gun 12 years ago. The room fell silent. Several of the pilots exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them mentally reassessing everything they thought they knew about the previous week's incident. Major Torres was the first to speak. Top Gun? Why were you flying cargo planes? It's a long story, Sarah replied. The short version is that I had a career-ending incident during my final week at the fighter weapons school. I chose to leave naval aviation rather than accept transfer to a non-combat role. Captain Mike Stevens, an F-22 pilot with over 1,000 hours in the Raptor, leaned forward. What kind of incident ends a Top Gun career? Sarah had known this question would come up eventually. She had prepared a brief version of the story that included the essential facts without getting into the emotional details. Another student lost control of his aircraft during a training exercise. He was going down and wouldn't eject. I used wake turbulence from my aircraft to disrupt the airflow around his jet and restore partial control. It worked, and he was able to land safely. But the investigation board ruled that I had violated safety protocols and demonstrated poor judgment under pressure. The pilots around the table were quiet as they absorbed this information. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel James Parker, the squadron commander, spoke up. Captain Chen, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You saved another pilot's life using an unauthorized maneuver that required extraordinary flying skill, and the Navy punished you for it. The board felt that I had endangered both aircraft unnecessarily, Sarah explained. They said that standard procedure called for the other pilot to eject, and that my intervention was reckless. Captain Stevens shook his head. With all due respect to the Navy, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. If someone had tried that maneuver to save my life, I'd nominate them for a medal, not a court-martial. Major Torres nodded in agreement. The Air Force has a different philosophy about risk assessment. We believe that extraordinary situations sometimes require extraordinary solutions. Sarah felt a wave of relief. She had expected skepticism or criticism from these experienced aviators. Instead, they seemed to understand and even approve of her decision. Dr. Walsh cleared her throat. If we could return to the technical briefing, I'd like to explain what we're trying to accomplish with this new test profile. She activated a large wall display showing a complex three-dimensional map. The original navigation test was designed to evaluate system performance under benign conditions. Based on Captain Chen's demonstration earlier this week, we've decided to design a much more challenging scenario. The map showed a simulated combat zone with multiple threat locations, electronic jamming sources, and time-critical navigation requirements. It was far more complex than anything a transport aircraft would normally encounter. The scenario assumes that Captain Chen is flying a combat mission deep in hostile territory, Dr. Walsh continued. Her primary navigation systems have been compromised by enemy jamming. GPS is unavailable, and she must rely entirely on our experimental system to reach her objectives and return safely. Lieutenant Colonel Parker studied the display. What kind of opposition will she be facing? Colonel Martinez answered. We'll have multiple aircraft playing the role of enemy fighters. Electronic warfare specialists will provide jamming and other countermeasures, and will include time pressure by requiring her to reach specific checkpoints within narrow windows. Sarah examined the proposed route and felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of mission she had trained for at Top Gun. Complex, dangerous, and requiring every skill she possessed. It was also far beyond anything she had attempted in over a decade. Dr. Walsh, Sarah said, this scenario is significantly more challenging than transport operations. Are you sure the navigation system is ready for this level of stress testing? The scientist smiled. Captain, after watching your performance against the F-16s, I realized we've been thinking too small. If this system is going to save lives in real combat situations, it needs to work when pilots are under maximum stress and pulling heavy Gs. Major Torres was studying the electronic jamming parameters. This is comprehensive. You're simulating everything from basic GPS denial to advanced multi-spectrum interference. How confident are you that the system will function under these conditions? That's what we're here to find out, Dr. Walsh replied. If the system fails during testing, we can identify the problems and fix them. If it fails during an actual combat mission, people die. Captain Stevens raised his hand. I have a question about the opposition forces. Are we talking about scripted encounters or free-play aggressor aircraft? Colonel Martinez smiled grimly. Free play. We've arranged for some of the best aggressor pilots in the Air Force to try their hardest to shoot down Captain Chen. They'll be using every trick in the book to make her mission as difficult as possible. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Free play exercises meant that the opposing pilots would be using their full skill and experience to defeat her. There would be no predetermined outcomes or safety limits beyond basic flight safety requirements. Who's playing the opposition? She asked. The 64th Aggressor Squadron from Nellis, Lieutenant Colonel Parker replied. They specialize in replicating foreign fighter tactics. They know every weakness of American aircraft and pilots. Sarah had heard of the 64th Aggressors. They were legendary for their ability to defeat American pilots in training exercises. Many of them were former Top Gun graduates who had moved into the aggressor role to challenge the next generation of fighter pilots. How many aircraft will they have? Sarah asked. 6 F-16s and 2 F-15s, Colonel Martinez replied. They'll be using advanced jamming pods and simulated missile systems. For all practical purposes, you'll be facing a numerically superior enemy force with technological advantages. Major Torres whistled softly. That's a significant challenge for any pilot, even in an F-22. Captain Chen, are you comfortable with this level of opposition? Sarah considered the question honestly. 12 years ago, at the peak of her abilities, she would have relished this kind of challenge. But she had spent over a decade flying transport aircraft. Her reflexes might be slower, her tactical knowledge might be outdated, and her confidence might not be what it once was. On the other hand, the F-22 was a far more capable aircraft than anything she had flown during her Navy career. Its stealth characteristics, advanced sensors, and superior performance gave her advantages that might offset her rustiness. I'm willing to give it a try, Sarah said finally. But I want to be clear about something. My last air-to-air combat was 12 years ago. I may not perform at the level you're expecting." Captain Stevens laughed. "Captain, if your performance against our F-16 was you being rusty, I can't wait to see you when you're sharp." Dr. Walsh activated another display showing the timeline for the mission. "We'll conduct the exercise in 3 phases. First, penetration of enemy airspace while evading detection. Second, navigation to multiple target areas while under electronic attack. Third, egress from the combat zone while being pursued by enemy fighters." Sarah studied the timeline. The entire mission would last approximately 90 minutes, with no breaks or opportunities to recover from mistakes. It was the kind of sustained, high-stress operation that tested every aspect of a pilot's skills. Dr. Walsh, what specific data are you hoping to collect during this exercise? Sarah asked. "Everything," the scientist replied. "Navigation accuracy under stress, system response to electronic jamming, pilot workload assessment, and integration with other aircraft systems. But most importantly, we want to know if a pilot can trust this system when their life depends on it." Lieutenant Colonel Parker nodded. "That's the key question. All the technical specifications in the world don't matter if pilots won't use the system when things get desperate." Sarah understood what he meant. Fighter pilots were notoriously skeptical of new technology, especially navigation systems. They had seen too many gadgets fail at critical moments. If Dr. Walsh's system was going to be adopted by operational units, it had to prove itself under the worst possible conditions. "When do we fly this mission?" Sarah asked. Colonel Martinez checked his watch. "Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. That gives you tonight to review the F-22 systems and plan your tactics." Major Torres stood up. "Captain Chen, I'd like to volunteer to help with your mission preparation. I have more F-22 hours than anyone else on the base, and I'd be happy to share what I know." Other pilots around the table began volunteering their assistance. Captain Stevens offered to brief her on the latest electronic warfare threats. Lieutenant Colonel Parker suggested that they run through some practice scenarios in the flight simulator. Sarah was overwhelmed by their support. She had expected professional cooperation, but these experienced aviators were treating her like a respected colleague rather than someone whose career had ended in disgrace. "Thank you all," Sarah said. "I appreciate the help more than you know." As the formal briefing ended and people began filing out of the room, Major Torres approached Sarah privately. "Captain, can I ask you something personal?" Torres said. "Do you miss it? Flying fighters, I mean?" Sarah thought about the question. For 11 years, she had tried to convince herself that she was happy flying cargo planes. She had built a good life, raised her daughter, and found satisfaction in reliable, predictable work. But sitting in this briefing room, surrounded by fighter pilots planning a challenging mission, Sarah realized how much she had missed this world. The intellectual challenge of tactical planning, the camaraderie of military aviators, the pure excitement of pushing aircraft and pilot to their limits. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "I miss it more than I ever admitted to myself." Torres smiled. "Well, tomorrow you get a chance to come home." That evening, Sarah sat in the F-22 simulator at Edwards, relearning systems that she had never fully mastered 12 years ago. The Raptor was far more complex than the F-18 she had flown in the Navy, with advanced stealth systems, sensor fusion technology, and weapons capabilities that still seemed like science fiction. Major Torres sat in the instructor's position, guiding Sarah through the various displays and controls. "The key to the F-22 is information management," Torres explained. "The aircraft can collect massive amounts of data about threats, targets, and navigation. Your job is to process that information quickly and make tactical decisions." Sarah practiced engaging multiple targets while maintaining stealth and navigating through simulated enemy airspace. The simulator threw every possible challenge at her: electronic jamming, mechanical failures, fuel emergencies, and multiple enemy aircraft attacking from different directions. Each scenario was more difficult than the last, designed to test her ability to multitask under extreme pressure. Sarah found her skills returning gradually, muscle memory taking over as she reacquainted herself with the demands of air combat. "You're doing well," Torres said as they completed another practice run. "Your instincts are still sharp. The main thing you need to work on is trusting the aircraft's systems. The F-22 can do things that would have been impossible in an F-18. By midnight, Sarah felt ready for the next day's mission. She was not back to her peak performance level, but she was confident that she could handle whatever challenges the aggressor pilots threw at her. As she drove home through the desert darkness, Sarah thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her bedroom. Tomorrow, for the first time in over a decade, her mother would climb into a fighter jet and face real danger. Not the manufactured risk of transport operations, but the genuine possibility of failure that made military aviation so challenging and rewarding. Sarah had spent 11 years trying to avoid that kind of risk. Tomorrow, she would embrace it once again. But first, she had one more conversation to have with her daughter. Emma deserved to know that her mother was about to step back into the world she had left behind so many years ago. Dawn was breaking over the Nevada desert as Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection of the F-22 Raptor. The aircraft looked different today, loaded with electronic warfare pods and equipped with advanced sensors for the navigation system test. This was no longer a routine evaluation flight. It was a combat mission in everything but name. Dr. Walsh stood nearby with her team of engineers, monitoring data feeds from the experimental navigation system. Colonel Martinez was coordinating with the aggressor squadron at Nellis Air Force Base, where 8 of the military's most skilled adversary pilots were preparing to hunt down Sarah's aircraft. "System checks are complete," Dr. Walsh reported. "Navigation package is online and ready." "How are you feeling, Captain?" Sarah settled into the ejection seat and began connecting her life support systems. "Ready as I'll ever be, ma'am." But inside, her heart was racing with a mixture of excitement and terror. 12 years ago, she had been one of the most confident fighter pilots in the Navy. Today, she felt like a rusty amateur attempting to play in the major leagues. The radio crackled with the voice of the mission controller. "Phoenix, this is Control. Aggressor aircraft are airborne and proceeding to the exercise area. Your mission clock starts in 15 minutes. Sarah ran through her final systems checks. Unlike her previous flight in the F-22, today she would be using all of the aircraft's capabilities. Stealth mode was active, electronic warfare systems were online, and the radar was configured for air-to-air combat. The Raptor was ready for war. "Phoenix, Control, you are cleared for takeoff. Good luck out there." Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt the F-22 surge down the runway. As the aircraft lifted into the morning sky, she experienced a familiar sensation that she had not felt in over a decade. The pure exhilaration of flying a fighter jet into combat. The first phase of the mission required her to penetrate simulated enemy airspace without being detected. 8 aggressor aircraft were patrolling the exercise area, using their radars to search for any sign of her approach. Sarah's job was to reach the first navigation checkpoint while remaining invisible. The F-22's stealth capabilities were remarkable. On enemy radar screens, the massive fighter jet would appear no larger than a small bird. But stealth was not perfect, and the aggressor pilots knew exactly what to look for. Sarah flew at 35,000 feet, using the thin air and high altitude to minimize her radar signature. Dr. Walsh's navigation system was working perfectly, providing precise position updates even though GPS signals were being jammed by enemy electronic warfare aircraft. "Navigation system is tracking beautifully," Dr. Walsh's voice came through the radio. "Accuracy is within 5 meters, despite heavy electronic interference." Sarah smiled grimly. The system might be working, but she was about to make its job much more difficult. Her radar warning receiver was detecting enemy search patterns ahead, and she would need to maneuver aggressively to avoid detection. An F-15 Eagle was patrolling directly across her planned route, its powerful radar sweeping back and forth in search of intruders. Sarah had 2 choices: climb higher and risk being spotted by other aircraft, or descend and use terrain masking to hide her approach. She chose a third option that would have made her Top Gun instructors proud. Sarah rolled the F-22 inverted and pulled into a steep dive, descending rapidly toward the desert floor. At 500 feet above ground level, she leveled off and began flying through the mountain valleys at over 500 miles per hour. The terrain following radar in the F-22 painted a detailed picture of the landscape ahead, allowing Sarah to navigate safely through the twisting canyons. But flying this low and this fast required absolute concentration and lightning-fast reflexes. "Phoenix, your altitude is extremely low." Dr. Walsh's voice was tight with concern. "Are you experiencing system problems?" "Negative, Control. I'm using terrain masking to avoid radar detection." What Sarah did not mention was that she was also testing herself. Low-level, high-speed flight through mountainous terrain was one of the most demanding forms of flying. If she could handle this without making mistakes, she would know that her skills had truly returned. The F-22 flashed between canyon walls, pulling G-forces as Sarah maneuvered around obstacles. The navigation system continued to provide accurate positioning data, despite the challenging environment, and continued electronic jamming. 15 minutes into the mission, Sarah reached the first checkpoint without being detected by any of the aggressor aircraft. Dr. Walsh's system had guided her flawlessly through the complex route, maintaining accuracy even during high-G maneuvering and electronic interference. But the second phase of the mission would be much more difficult. "Phoenix, Control. Proceed to Checkpoint 2. Be advised that enemy aircraft are beginning to vector toward your general area." Sarah's radar display showed multiple contacts converging on her location. The aggressor pilots had not detected her directly, but they were smart enough to recognize that she had to be somewhere in the exercise area. They were beginning a systematic search pattern that would eventually force her into the open. The second checkpoint was located deep in enemy territory, requiring Sarah to fly through an area heavily patrolled by hostile aircraft. Making matters worse, enemy electronic warfare aircraft were now focusing their jamming efforts on her general location. "Navigation accuracy is degrading," Dr. Walsh reported. "Enemy jamming is becoming more effective as you approach their main force."